So my name is Mona Hamdy. I'm a PhD candidate, a teaching fellow of applied ethics, and a research fellow at Harvard University's Divinity School. And this is Venture Funding Too Much or Just Enough. We have Carter Reum, the co-founder of M13, Sumant Mandal, the managing director of March Capital Partners, the co-founder of the Hive, and Gauba, the founder and managing director of the CXO Fund, here to talk with us about this today. So, topic of conversation this year has seen 14 megafunds raising $14.4 billion, gentlemen. Huge number, mega deals, this Tyranna VC Rex. It's changing the game and changing the way deals are done and changing the implications in the large-scale venture funds. So, good morning. Where do we start, Sumant?
I don't know how this works, but I think it's still a very small number. How about that?
You think it's a small number?
It's much smaller than the $100 billion fund that came before it. So it's all just numbers.
Yeah, I think there's two ways to think about it. There's kind of always a positive side and kind of a negative side, right? So I think when you look at it in one respect, the last few years of venture were all about market share, right? You had to go out and you had to be the first to market, and kind of the Reid Hoffman theory, you kind of had to win, and a lot of times there was no second place, right? And so I think whenever you look at venture and tech, there's always got a different trend that go the next few years. I think so. Investors were willing to give companies too much money at the risk of creating companies that weren't sustainable, weren't profitable. But on the flip side, you had too much to lose by kind of not winning market share.
You know why the 14 billion number, right? I think suddenly the VCs are waking up, right? You're going to have 200 billion connected devices by year 2020, generating 40 zettabytes of data. Anybody? How many zeros in a zettabyte? No, you can't say that, you know that. 21 zeros in a zettabyte, right? So with this data tsunami coming up, right, people are just gearing up to see how we can monetize this crazy amount of data which will be generated. So that's
kind of why. Yeah. So does that mean that's
logic.
it, guys? Panel's over. Do you think? But so Carter, that means that not much has changed then. If it's sort of the rush to the mega exit or the rush to be the first, what is changing then in the landscape when we are talking about zettabytes and billions?
Yeah, I think, again, it's constantly changing. I think the one thing that's constant is the world in general has changed more in the last 5-10 years because technology allows a lot of shifts. As a result, the type of companies that are built, the funding needs and all that shifts very quickly as well. I think, one of the trends that I point out all the time that I think you've already seen filter down is that the private markets previously, the last 4 or 5 years, had rewarded growth at all costs, right? I think the public markets have come out and spoken and said, whoa, right? Growth at all costs is not going to be rewarded. You need profitable and sustainable companies because that's what we're looking at, right? And so very quickly it's changed behavior, right? Take Lyft and Uber. They both moved up their profitability by 2 years. They said, shoot, if that's what you want, I can do that. I just have to change kind of my P&L and some things like that. And so there's always going to be these things that change, adapt, and I think we'll continue to see different changes moving forward.
Gary?
No, go ahead, someone, go ahead.
I was just going to ask Gary what he thinks, but...
What do you think, Gary? How many zettabytes in that answer?
Sumant is now doing this PhD postdoc in the predictive business, self-learning algorithms, right? He can read my mind. But one of the things, right, we got to be super cautious, right, with the amount of funding which is coming out there. And especially, some of the first-time entrepreneurs, and we have seen that in the market, right, as a lot of this money comes, right, it does get into their head, right, and so the discipline, the governance will need to be very critical, and we have seen some of the examples. But at the same time, right, it's just not about putting the money. How do we, as VCs, accelerate the value while mitigating the risk? And that was kind of the genesis of the CXO fund, right, where you have 100 plus CXOs in the platform, CEOs, CFOs, CIOs of Fortune 500 companies. And so from our perspective, right, it's just not about putting the money. How do you accelerate the value and drive a serious corporate governance as well?
Yeah, I've been doing this now for 20 years. I think the venture industry is maybe twice as old as that, maybe. Um, and I think what we see happening now, or has been happening for the last 5-10 years, is hard for me as a practitioner to think of that as venture capital as it was traditionally known. Venture capital was someone's got an idea, they want to start something, they go find someone who's done it before who can be their mentor, someone who can help them, fund them, take them to the next level, help them with the different things. And right now it seems like it's more about just closer to private equity than it is to venture, which is about numbers and it's about putting money to work to scale companies rather than, as Gary said, helping them when they're really starting out. There's reason for that. And part of that reason is that companies used to go public, when they were 5-7 years old. A company that was listing at a $500 million to $1 billion market cap was considered a good IPO. And then you had all the governance that a public market sort of brought to bear when it was, whether it was results, whether it was corporate governance, all the stuff that I think companies at that size and scale kind of inherited by going public. In the private markets, you don't see that. An average IPO now is between 11 and 12 years old. You're doing private rounds at tens of billions of dollars of valuation. I mean, there was, 15 years ago, if you had an exit at $1 billion, you were thrilled. You were giving high fives to everyone. It didn't happen. And now $1 billion seems like it's, poor guys, it didn't work.
What did you do wrong?
It didn't work.
So if I can add, maybe I'll share some facts, right? Think about year 2010, right? The 5 companies which were, driving a lot of the market cap, right? You had GE, Walmart, Cisco was only the one technology company, Pfizer, and today, right, if you fast forward, right, the 4.1 trillion market cap is driven by 4 companies, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, right? And so we are at that inflection point, right, where technology is pivoting, right, with all of us talk about 5G and quantum, right? 5G is coming at us at a much faster pace than what all of us are thinking. And quantum, obviously, is still further out, right? And AI, machine learning, big data, that's the biggest buzz, how it's gonna change the marketplace, right? So, and that's also driving, right, the amount of funding, because if you don't get on the train, right, you will be left behind, period, right? And so those are some of the dynamics, right, which are driving the funding. But I think to Sumant's point earlier, right, and my point, right, the governance is going to become very critical.
Governance and regulation, we hear a lot.
Yeah, and I will say, when we talk of these numbers, there is concentration now in venture capital.
Yeah.
There are fewer funds raising more money. And a lot of this money that's being raised is going into later stage deals. The early stage, even though it's more than it used to be, there's no question there's a trickle-down effect and more people are doing it. It's still, what we do, we kind of think of a peer group of maybe 20 other funds that do that. It's not like there's 200 funds with hundreds of billions of dollars behind them at the stages that we participate in. But our companies, I'll add to all of this, are growing at an unprecedented rate. I mean, we have companies generating hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue, doubling and tripling every year. And that never used to happen. 20-30% growth was considered incredible. Part of that is driven by the fact, as what Gary was talking about, it's now much easier to distribute technology. So these companies can scale a lot quicker. Technology is all pervasive. It's not just it's not a vertical anymore, it's a horizontal. It touches everything. And so the market sizes are massive, much larger than they used to be. So all of these things combined give you the illusion of sort of, there's too much money. It really isn't too much money. Now, there is too much money going into some things that it shouldn't be going into. That's just bad judgment. That's not too much money.
Can we talk about that for a second? But I really do want to talk about the nature of the way the VC firms are working. I read, there was something that said, these new monoliths are multi-stage battleship firms with scout programs, venture teams, and growth funds. So does it make sense for these firms to raise their own debt funds? Like, what happens when you roll it over? If are we looking at partnerships in the future? You roll it over into your Series B, and then you have these founders who get that sweet, sweet taste of dilution-free capital. Like, what happens? What happens next? Are we looking at these VC, PE firms?
There is no free capital. Debt is not free,
Carter.
especially in early stage companies where there is no free cash flow, there's no profitability. Debt is not free. It's just something that hangs over on your head. And if things go slightly south, you're screwed. Everyone's screwed. So I'm just not a big proponent of debt in these private companies. So that's just the debt
Having
question.
said that,
No, not having said that. I am often overruled by my entrepreneurs. But I think there is definitely a shift in the industry. There are funds of our sizes, which at some point 10 years ago were considered good size funds, now look like micro funds. They do play a role in the early stages of getting a company up and running. I think very good firms like Sequoia and Accel and others have vertically integrated, partly as a reaction to what SoftBank did, partly because there is an opportunity for them to invest in these companies because they're staying private longer. We do the same. It's not like we don't participate in that ecosystem. But you mentioned I started an incubator called the Hive, and in what we do there, Gary's involved in that too. And the Hive and the Fabric, 2 incubators we start our own companies. Those are $25, $30 million entities. Then you have a venture fund that invests in the next round, and you have a growth fund that invests in the next round. And then you have the pre-IPO round, and hopefully those companies work. And what happens, which is also, I think, part of our industry, more than 95% of the companies that actually work get acquired. They don't go public. So you don't even get to that pre-IPO round, and then go before them. But a lot of money is being concentrated in these winners that can stand out and be market, sort of leaders, because the size of the market and the entities that are creating the value are so large.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that's a good point, right? You see it's kind of why the 4 companies account for so much market cap, is that when you have a winner these days, you pour so much more capital into it than previously, right? Because of the fact that you can scale it so quickly, right? So we focus on consumer technology the same way as we think about tech used to be a vertical, now it's a horizontal layer. We believe, right, technology allows you to kind of get to a consumer, disintermediate traditional distribution models. But in our world, right, Kevin Plank and Under Armour was the first consumer company to get to 100 million in revenue, or the fastest, not the first. And it only took them 10 years, right? A top quartile e-com company will now do that in about 2.5 or 3 years. And I think the other thing, I think what everyone's pointed out is the funding and the size of funds and structure of funds is starting to mimic behaviors you're seeing in venture, right? So they're staying private longer, so then funds have to evolve and go kind of more vertical. In the same way, also in technology, there's so many flywheel effects, right? And so the big are going to continue to get bigger because of the flywheel effects around data and kind of other things as well.
So I think to both Sumant and Carter's point, right, as I mentioned earlier, right, we are literally at that inflection point. And if you look at the Fortune 500 companies, they are talking about the innovation, but they're their own worst enemy. The bigger they get, right, more bureaucracy and blocks which kick in. We are of a strong belief, right, and that's the reason we launched the CXO platform. There'll be a mega emergence of startups, because some of these, whether it's quantum or 5G, or even the brick and mortar companies, right? Let's just say construction, right? Construction tech and 5G. What does that really mean? Okay, so those companies don't exist today. So a lot of money would have to be poured, right, to get those companies started, right? And how do you accelerate those companies? Because there's a clear need, right? There's going to be a race out there. So I think it's going to be interesting dynamics over the 18 to 24 months. I know general tendency is late stage and growth stage companies, but the dynamics are changing, and we'll have to get ahead.
So there's something that when we're talking about the rush to fund and we're talking about these just massive funding amounts, this is something that I wanted to bring up with you, Carter. You had mentioned an interesting statistic about the number of women at M13, the number of women founders, funders, and people on the board. Because typically, like when you talk to Sarah Kunst, for example, at Clio Capital, says it's quite clear that the people who are being funded at seed, pre-seed, or even at later stages are not women, they're not people of color, they're not traditionally underrepresented minorities. So what are we looking at with this new model?
Yeah, so I always use the stat that 40% of our companies are female-led. Our track record suggests we're one of the top VCs in what we do, and so I think it's just good business. So I think we can all agree that females make better startup founders. That's a joke. Not really a joke, but okay, I was just hoping for a little laughter. Just want to make sure everyone was awake here. But I think, I think what I would say is the industry is trying to address the kind of where traditional funding has gone. I think it's debatable whether we're doing enough fast enough, but I think people are certainly confronting it. I look at it as the positive, which we live in an age where there's been a total democratization of starting a company, right? If you have a good idea, it's never been easier to start a company. I think where you still see that play out is access to mentorship, access to capital, and things like that. And so I think what we all need to do is make sure we're providing that to people of color and females and others that might not have the same access. But I think, again, we're living in a golden era where it's possible if we all kind of face it head on and kind of do our part.
So I think I agree, and I'll point out a couple of things that are probably encouraging trends. 20 years ago, a company would walk in with an Indian founder and a VC would say, so who's going to be the CEO? I know you're going to be a good CTO, but who's the CEO? And today you look at Alphabet, you look at all the interesting tech companies, whether it's Sundar or Satya or now at IBM. IBM has an Indian CEO. I was like, wow, that's 20 years ago, I couldn't have dreamt of it. So there is a definite shift. At least we can see that shift. Now we're enterprise investors. There's less women doing enterprise technology. When I went to college for undergrad, for engineering school, out of the 400 people in that class, there were 2 women. And I'm hoping that number is now at least 40, if not more. So those things have a trajectory and a change, and as more and more women enter that, and I think they are into the fields that we operate in, there will be more and more founders who, actually I think we do have women founders. We have a separate fund that we seeded that only invests in women entrepreneurs, more consumer focused. So, I think that's changing. We both have daughters. His daughter actually worked for one of our companies and now is a founder of a company, and I don't understand anything what she talks about because it's all about Bitcoin and blockchain and it's beyond me. And so, but it's fascinating. It's great to see. Right? It's actually fun to see.
So if you look at our portfolio, right, 70% of the founders are pretty diverse, right? And there are quite a few women founders. The latest investment we did, a 27-year-old, right, a deep technologist, but amazingly business savvy, trying to democratize AI. So you don't need data scientists, right? You can, an analyst can do the data science work, right? So to me, I think there's not only the women founders, right, but founders across the globe, right, from different races. I think that's the way the future would be. And as Sumant was mentioning, right, I've got 3 daughters, so I'm surrounded with 4 beautiful women in the house, right? The 21-year-old now went to Berkeley to do EECS, right? After 1 year, she was deep into blockchain. She said, Dad, I'm launching my first company. I said, okay, and they're on their way. And
she quit school.
Yeah, she said, I'm taking.
Quit school.
She said, I'm taking time off. When I have to learn, I can go back. And they've created a, deep into blockchain insurance marketplace, which is insuring their crypto assets, right? It's a pretty interesting stuff.
I was going to say, I think another encouraging fund that you see is that, right, you've seen the rise of the micro fund in the U.S. at least, right? So there's just shy of 1,000 funds under $100 million. And so where the diversification of capital is these micro funds, right? You still have kind of the bigger funds that are vertically integrated. So the more that capital gets distributed among more funds, the more likely, you kind of democratize that early stage funding where it's typically been the hardest. And so I think, again, another encouraging fund or kind of fact along with, never been easier to start a company.
Globally.
Yeah, and I think one other thing we'll have to watch, right? This Generation Z is in a different zip code, and we'll have to really pay strong.
What are you?
Well, depending on which side of the bed I get up, right?
I don't even know where to go right now with that. Let's see. So let's talk about that. So global growth, and we're talking about these funds and in your particular funds. What are the challenges and what are things that have been made easier? We've talked about regulation a lot. You've talked about what are we looking at on the horizon? What are you facing? What are you looking at?
Yeah, I think the biggest change for anyone who's a venture capital is just that it's never been easier to start a company, right? So, we probably invest in less than 2% of the companies we see. And so anyone investing in the asset class has to figure out how do you take all these companies and distill down the ones that are kind of backable and that have the greatest likelihood of success. I think on the flip side, right, we live in an age where there's a ton of data, right? And so if you can see it in the data typically much earlier, if a company has a real chance of being kind of scalable and really being something that the world kind of needs. But I think for us, that's the biggest thing we face and think about all the time, is because it's never been easier to start a company, and it's only getting easier. And so again, that will continue to affect the industry.
So, again, if you look back at in the last 10 years, venture capital has been geographically democratized. It used to be that you had the Bay Area and you have a little bit in Boston. We both live in LA. LA was considered a backwater 10 years ago. Now there's enough happening for actually us to
Silicon
exist
Beach.
there. Yeah. But we also have an office in India, and we have an office in Sao Paulo, and we've been watching those ecosystems develop. And if you look at what happened with China the last couple of decades, China is about 80% of the volume of venture that goes into the US goes into China. So it's actually getting to a place where it's comparable. Actually, the Chinese market in many ways is much larger than the US market. So if you look at China just as one venture sort of a technology entity, there's some place now that competes with the US. We'll see what happens after this year, but essentially has been for the last few years. India is a very different market. For the last 20 years, India has been a services-oriented BPO/labor arbitrage market for technology. The last 5 years, now we've started to see product companies, enterprise software product companies come out of India that compete globally. And there's probably 25 companies, so it's very small, that are between $5 and $25 million of revenue. There's probably 200 behind them. So, I think in the next 5 to 10 years, you'll see the emergence of these new hubs, whether it's the Israel model for companies building something, coming out and going to the world, whether it's domestic markets evolve, whether it's in Africa or in China or in India, domestic markets evolving to a place where you can build tens of billions of dollars of equity value in technology. So all of this is happening around us, which is very exciting, because for me, now I participate in an industry that's N times larger than what I thought it was going to be or what it was 10 years ago. So when you say there's a lot of money, I always look at the opportunity set and say, I don't think there's enough money. It's concentrated, maybe it's too much in one stage or around one type of company. But there's definitely lots of opportunity behind it that's not been addressed. Absolutely not being addressed.
So I'll give you my perspective, right? Before I launched the CXO fund, I built 3 companies ground up and in a lot of different areas, right? Pure play ASP, what is cloud computing right now in 95 to 99. Last company was all in the AI, machine learning, big data. In my case, I never raised a penny, self-funded, bootstrapped the companies. And then I said, okay, how do we disrupt the VC market? It's just not about putting the money in the companies. How do you accelerate the value while mitigating the risk? To me, that's primo, right? A lot of you guys who have your own family offices of funds, right? Principal protection becomes very critical. And that was the core fundamental run. How do we mitigate the risk? So that's where the CXO platform kicked in, where you have CEOs, CFOs, CIOs, CTOs of Fortune 500 companies who are investors. And so you get deeply engaged, right? Beyond putting the money. Do they have the right technology platform? Does it need a pivot? Do they have the right co-innovation customers? Do they have the right strategic partners? Do they have the right pricing? Are they missing, right? So there needs to be a deeper engagement. I know Sumant was kind of mentioning earlier, right? The VC and the PE model is kind of converging a little bit, right? Because as a lot of money is going in, you got to have a deeper discipline. How do you accelerate the value? And some of the things we're doing out here too, right? I know Ibrahim is not in the room, right? With Mubadala and Hub 71. So there's some interesting, co-innovation elements.
I was going to say, I think one thing to build on what they're both saying is that shockingly, not every company is $1 billion company, right? And that's okay, right? So there's a company that recently IPO'd that is valued at $500 million. That's still a great result to create a $500 million company in 5 years. The only problem was it was funded, built, and the expectations were that it was a multi-billion-dollar company. And so I think you're going to see a lot more. And I think the challenge has been that people don't know what to value these companies at, and it's been very challenging. And to be fair, it's hard to say, right? Companies are scaling so fast. Technology is disrupting so fast. So what's the value of that? I don't know. Is Apple valued correctly? Is Tesla, right? Tesla is going to produce, 500,000 cars, and it's, worth more. And so I think it is a universal truth, though. There will be fewer kind of multi-billion-dollar exits, right? The big ones will win. And so I think the point to what everyone's saying is Therefore, you need to build better companies because you need to change the risk-reward spectrum. So the same way, right, we have a large tech platform where we've institutionalized all the things that entrepreneurs need to build successful companies. We have a large operating team that sits on top of it. And I tell people all the time, we're trying to create venture-type returns with private equity-type risk. But I think, again, you're hearing the universal truth here is that we have to build better companies and you have to change the risk end of the spectrum. Because I think there was a time, I was probably guilty of it like everyone else, we thought there would be a greater fool. That greater fool could have been M&A, that greater fool could have been the stock markets, the jury's out, or there's no greater fool. So you have to basically build better companies faster that are actually sustainable and can be profitable long term.
I mean, no pressure, right? But that's exactly the name of the game. How do you do that when time, I mean, just that scalability of time, because on the flip side of that, you have companies that have tens, hundreds of millions of dollars of funding and no real proven viability or...
Yeah, well, I think two things. One thing would be interesting to just talk about time as a factor in tech, because I think one of the things is when you think about venture, by definition, these are all companies trying to disrupt corporates. Yeah. The one thing that corporates don't do well is they don't move quickly, right? So time is something, and funding also dictates time, right? Companies have to scale faster to beat incumbents, and therefore the funding comes faster. So it's an interesting mix. I think to answer your first question, though, I feel badly at times for companies that have been asked to grow at all costs, because that's what was demanded of them for the last few years. And then we changed the game and said, actually, we need you to build sustainable, profitable companies. Again, Lyft and Uber are great examples. They said, sure, if that's what you want us to do, we'll pull down our growth rates and we'll be profitable. But it does kind of take time to do that.
I think the one thing we aren't addressing, which is sort of where all our businesses have their, I'd say, unique points, is talent. And essentially, companies are a group of individuals, people coming together, whether it's internally, the founders, the teams they build around them, or the investors and the board and the advisory stuff that they build around them. Our battle is always about finding talent. I mean, I think money is sort of follows talent, and as simple as that. And part of our job is to find that talent and give them the opportunity to grow. So where I see the choke point in our business is there's a lack of talent. And frankly, what happens is you compromise, and you compromise by funding a good idea, but not with the right talent. You compromise by choosing to hire someone, even though you feel like it's probably not a good idea, but you know what, time is of the essence, you make a mistake there. So in some ways, this sort of pressure of getting there quicker is making us make wrong decisions. And even though you make, you say you won't make the same mistake again, you definitely do, because the pressure is so much. I think there has been a little bit of a reset over the last 6 months or a year, in people saying we're going to take a step back and let's look at what really works and what doesn't. Let's fund things that matter. Let things that don't work die off, or let's figure out the right place for them or the right trajectory. If it's $500 million exit, great, let's take it and move on, not try and force fit something that doesn't work. So that has come back to reality in some ways. It's not 100% of where it needs to be, but the exuberance of the last, or I'd say irrationality of the last few years in venture is sort of dissipating. So this too much money question, I think, will go away in the next couple of years.
I agree with Sumant, right? So two big criteria, right, when we are looking at investing in companies is team and time. And without a good team, right, you could have the best idea, but it's going to be tough, right? But other thing which I talk a lot about, right, especially for the first-time founders, it's a little bit more complex versus a repeat entrepreneurs, right? Understanding the human psychology and how do you get the best out of that team are critical elements. I know Sumant and Aspar, right, on some of the companies we have invested, right? Great founder, great technology founder, but he's not a CEO, right? And doubling down on finding the right leader who can step up the game and ensuring how does he get the best out of the people. So I think I agree with Sumant, right? The talent and the team is absolutely critical.
Chris, Carter, did you want to say something on that? So, I think it brings me back to that point, and Sumant, we had a discussion about that a little bit earlier too, about Ben Horowitz saying talent is more equally distributed than opportunity. I think we come back to that point about distribution of funds and then opportunity, and just getting in front of funds and that sort of thing. I mean, again, the faster it moves, the faster you guys have to move, the more you have to rush toward exit profitability at all costs. But how do you do that in real time? Like,
So I think the if I remember the conversation, it was more around access to the opportunity to go out and build companies, and is it equally distributed? And obviously the answer would be no, not today. It's not equally distributed, but it is more equal than it was 10 years ago. And so over time, I think as more and more people understand how important this world of technology is and want to enter into it, and more, and we come back to the same thing: is there too much money? No, it's not. There is not money distributed into the areas where the opportunity exists. Money is concentrated, and there's sort of this fallacy of money being concentrated because it sort of says, because you were successful in the past, you're going to be successful in the future. Therefore, let's quadruple your size and make that success 4 times. It doesn't necessarily work that clearly, right? But like I mentioned before, you are seeing other geographical areas come up. You are seeing other, I don't want to use the word race, but let's say people from different backgrounds come up. I think you are seeing more and more women entrepreneurs, more than you ever did before. It's not where we want it to be. Not anyone would say that, but I am very positive about the trend. More has to be done, but I'm very positive about the trend.
Yeah, I was just, before coming out here, I was on a LATAM roadshow in Mexico City, Argentina. I cannot go to Chile and Brazil, right? But I think there's interesting dynamics, right? Of how, like Mexico City, right? A lot of the people we met, they're saying we are at least 10 to 15 years behind. But there's a big resurgence right out here where they want to get ahead, right? Same thing in Argentina, right? So there's, across the globe, right, there's a lot of talent and ideas, right?
But not just internationally. I mean, LA is a very interesting market. I started in the year 2000 in LA in a firm called Idea Lab Capital. It was an incubator that was in LA in Pasadena, right next to Caltech. It was the first of its type. And everybody thought LA has arrived because there were companies that were going public and there was a lot of billion-dollar entities. And then 2001 happened and everyone ran away. I mean, it was like almost like venture did not exist in LA. It never had. And then it took a good 5-6 years, maybe more, for a new wave of companies to come up in LA. And I think Snapchat was the first sort of, I would say, company of size and stature that came out. In Southern California, we did CrowdStrike, which is a cybersecurity company a few years ago. That's done very well coming out of Southern California. So you start seeing a resurgence. Now, why is that happening? Because there have been role models. People have actually seen that it can work and you can succeed and stay independent and build a company in that place. If you hadn't seen it before, you don't really imagine it. So role models are very important in everything we do, and it just takes time.
Yeah, I think it goes back to also, like, obviously we're biased that LA's having a moment. People forget, SpaceX, Snapchat, League of Legends, Riot Games, $10 billion company plus, all LA based. But I think the reason why you're seeing so much happen in a place like LA is actually the companies are built, the talent comes, more companies are built. And again, it's always the flywheel. And again, there's never been a easier time to start a company, to have a good idea, but therefore it's never been harder to scale a successful company. And therefore it's put an even bigger premium on talent because ideas are cheap, execution is dear effectively.
One more trend that lends itself to that is that technology is no longer about people just sitting around designing a semiconductor. You are building a technology healthcare company. You can do it anywhere. You're building a technology entertainment company. LA is a great place to go do that. So I think there's also this pervasiveness of the horizontal of the technology that's happening. So if you look at Brazil and the companies we've invested there, they all have some kind of a natural resources of fintech kind of flavor to them. Why? Because that area, that country has that business behind it. And they're probably the world's experts around those things.
One of the things, right, you will see a lot more and more, right, to my earlier point, right, with this 200 billion connected devices generating the amount of data, and the human to device interaction is very big. And that opens up a lot of doors for the bad guys to get into your network. So cyber is going to continue to be a big area, and we'll see massive companies coming out of in that area. I know CrowdStrike, someone mentioned, right? 83% of your attacks last year costed us $2.3 trillion were due to compromised credentials, username, how many times we forget our password and the plastic badge, right? So that's something I would strongly, and you will see a lot of money continue to go in that area, and a lot of the boardroom discussions are about cyber. And identity is going to become a very big play. And I was sharing with some of you guys, right? So the next generation, there's one of the companies we have curated, right? Your smartphone becomes your badge, your identity, and tracks your behavior with 99.99% accuracy using behavioral algorithms. So if you lose your phone, which you did, and if I grab the phone and try to enter, it will know based on how I'm moving the fingers that's not Mona. It'll shut down your access. And if you are, it activates your access into the building, activates your network, activates your phone. If you're working on your laptop and you get away to grab a coffee, and Carter tries to play with it, all right? Just wanted to see if Carter was paying attention. It'll shut you down. So, so there's a lot of things which are shaping up, right? So is 14 billion enough? No, right? Because there are a lot of things which are changing.
I doubt I'm going to find anyone in this room who says that 14 billion is too much or not enough. But are there challenges? Are there anything that's unique to enterprise then in the space, I guess? Are there challenges that are unique in that world?
There are, and I think all of us have different flavors of venture that we kind of participate in. In the enterprise world, every 5 to 10 years, there's a new wave of technology that reinvents the entire enterprise stack. In the last 10 years, it's been cloud-driven. I think the last 4 or 5 years has been data, AI-driven companies. I think 5G is another kind of impetus. And if you have for me to imagine a zero latency network that is all pervasive and hopefully not very expensive, what can you do with it? It defies your imagination. And I think that's going to redefine how people do smart cities. It's going to redefine autonomous vehicles. It's going to redefine industrial networks. So it's super exciting. We invested in a quantum company in Cambridge in the UK. And half the time I don't understand being trained in classical engineering stuff and classical physics, you have a very hard time trying to imagine what quantum is. But it's fascinating that you have these things where you kind of have, quantum was more described in wisdom traditions. It's not a science thing, it's a spiritual thing. It's coming to science. It's kind of like, okay, what's happening here? And why is this going to be important? But then you look at the applications and where it's going, and you look at new types of material science being redeveloped using quantum. You look at chemicals, look at, the kind of stuff that you couldn't have imagined that you would do that. So that's why I keep saying, I don't think there's enough money in what we do.
I think the other thing that he touched on, and I agree, not enough money. So if any of you guys are investors in the room, just grab us, obviously, afterwards.
We'll take it.
But I think the other thing I talk about in tech and venture all the time is kind of the second and third ripple effects of all this change, right? And so I think it's why everybody is pouring money in venture. Everyone's trying to see the world further downstream because changes are happening faster than ever, right? And people don't realize a change in ride sharing is going to make a change in healthcare, or a change in ride sharing could make a concept in something like real estate. So I used the example recently, fast casual concepts in New York City. Around 70% of their revenue is going out the back door in terms of food delivery. And so I was saying to a real estate guy, he was saying, well, I do real estate, that's the safest, it's never going to change. I was like, just humor me. If 70% is going out the back door, do you think they're willing to pay the same premium for a lease facing Fifth Avenue as around the corner? Of course not, right? But he thinks food delivery has nothing to do with real estate, but of course it does. And I think that's the one thing that's really interesting in the world we're living. It's happening so fast, right? I mean, think about Uber and Lyft didn't exist 6, 7, 8 years ago, right? Facebook didn't exist. What did we all do all day? I don't know, like we took cabs and we had to talk to each other, but it's happening so fast. And I think one thing I always encourage people to think about, what are the second and third ripple effects, right? So 5G, I don't invest in enterprise, but I think to myself, what are these two very smart guys talking about? What can I glean from it that's going to change consumer behavior, because the ripples are huge?
I think 5G is coming at us at a much faster pace, right? We truly believe it's more 18 months out versus 5 years out. And it's going to boil down to the use cases at the edge, right? And you will see some major movement. And quantum, we have invested in a pretty interesting quantum company. The quantum computers are still further out. And quantum physics is going to play a very pivotal role, right? But the use cases, and that's what a lot of the quantum companies are doing today. But again, right, as you talk about Uber, as lifts of the word, right, they are collecting crazy amount of data. They've not scratched the surface how you can monetize that data.
It's a lot of money, and
Yeah.
to me, it's a lot of money. It's really fast, and there's not enough regulation to keep pace with it. And I don't know what the onus is on. I think that's where we find ourselves in that sort of government, regional, municipality, public, private sector. How do you keep pace, and how do you set the tone? I think we hear that a lot. How do we face this data in and out of enterprise?
I was just going to touch on, before we open it up for questions, the fact, all of what we're talking about, technology does have human consequences. And, one is, of course, access, democratization of availability and to build something. But it's also around jobs. It's also around retraining of human capital. There's a lot of other things that are second wave effects of what we do as the enterprises become more automated, more efficient, need less people. What's the role of regulation? What's the role of government? And I think all of this is going to be sorted out in the next 5 to 10 years also. It has to be. Otherwise, I don't know who's going to pay for all of this and who's going to suffer because of all of this. And so there is a constant dialogue that is needed between businesses, between educational institutes, between the government. I'm not sure, I'm being a little naive saying this, or maybe being, imagining a world that doesn't exist, but it does happen. The call center business, just as an example, is $350 billion spent a year. 7% of the workforce in the US works in some way, shape, or form in that kind of call center businesses. So that's a huge, 200 billion of that 350 billion is spent purely on salaries, on human capital. And so if you start putting the technologies that we kind of invest in, you start creating 5%, 10%, 20% efficiency, that means less people are needed, right? So what happens to that workforce? And so those are the kinds of things I think that we do need a dialogue around, and I'm not sure it belongs in this panel, but I do find it quite interesting.
Yeah. Just to add to that, just to add to that fact, right? Again, right, guys, this is a global aspects we're talking about, right? Whether it's Middle East or Africa or Asia Pac or otherwise, right? But the big thing, right, which is going to continue to emerge is ethics and AI, right? As we get deeper into the self-learning, right? And these algorithms, right? Can they replace the humans? They cannot, right? But can they really understand the emotions of the humans, right? And so this is something where the government and businesses and the academia will need to get deeper around the ethics. And a different topic, but I did want to touch on that as well.
That's more my topic. I think I can definitely tell you that this is one of the places where in venture capital, on the ethics side, I sit on a lot of panels where we have regulatory and advisory over AI, and this is a place where we see VCs, I think, funding things that end up overselling what AI is and what it can do, and the regulatory framework has not been built and is not there yet. So I can definitely say that. Any final thoughts before we open up to Q&A, gentlemen?
No, all I would say is I think it's interesting, right? There's obviously been some tech companies that have been built and probably rightfully so been criticized because I don't think they were built in the right way. But I also think it's just good to remember that we have lived in an age where, as consumers, whether it's healthcare, transportation, that we have never had more rapid innovation, which has had more positive change, right? I tell people I stopped driving my car in LA 2.5 years ago. The effect of that was I get to spend more time with loved ones, right? Because I can move around and I can work in the car and things like that. So I think I look at it from a very positive aspect, which is there's never been more positive change, and that's going to continue and hopefully make the world a better place.
So I would like to open it up to questions from the audience and from my dear friend, Mr. Stitt.
Thank you. My name is Charles Stitt, and I served as President Clinton's ambassador to Tanzania. And it was during an era where we were really trying to drive regional integration for investment purposes on the continent of Africa. The Africa Growth and Opportunity Act was one of the signature programs coming out of the administration. So it was a tacit appreciation that the continent had potential, that we had to organize and think about it differently if that potential was going to be actualized. I've been doing business on the continent for 15 years. When I look at the topic for the session, venture capital, too much or not enough, relative to Africa is a pretty easy question to answer, because you take to and yet and put not, and that's the answer. And so the question that, if we aren't prepared to deal with it today, that's okay. But I think we need to leave here with that as a homework assignment. On a conference that's focused on the Middle East and Africa, if we're serious about Africa, one of the questions that we have to ask for a continent that is great and expansive in terms of opportunities. In the mineral sector, the second largest helium discovery on the planet was in Africa. You look at next generation commodities like graphite, some of the richest veins in the world are in Africa. The opportunities in terms of agriculture. There's a lot of opportunity there, but not enough capital to actualize it. And in a conference like this, I think we ought to at least ask that question.
Yeah.
Back to talent more evenly distributed than opportunity. I will say that as an Egyptian straddling both the Middle East and Africa, this is true. We talk about, when we talk about banking the unbanked and silently, we're talking about really Africa. We're talking about unexplored populations in South America. We're talking about, the bottom 2 billion globally. How does that apply, gentlemen? What are we looking at?
I mean, one of my reactions to what you said, because I think it's a great point, so thank you for raising it, is that as an investor, I always talk about how the perception of risk is often confused with the lack of knowledge, right? And so the reason, right, there's a lot of venture capital money in places like Europe, but even Europe is much smaller than the US. I think we all, someone in my shoes, I understand how big, how important Africa is as a continent, and there's a lot of innovation. I was in Rwanda the other day, absolutely love Tanzania. I think one of the things that people like myself and others need to commit to is spending more time on the region, right? Because it's hard for me to understand consumer behavior, what's going to work in the market with it being so far, albeit respecting that you have to understand that, right? And I can tell you, for me, I came here to the Middle East because I wanted to understand the Middle East better, right? And so I committed to that. And I think, again, one thing we can all commit to doing is spending more time in places like Africa, therefore identifying more entrepreneurs and understanding where the investment opportunities are. So we change that equation that the perception of risk is often confused with the lack of knowledge.
And that Gary, why?
Yeah, no, I think same thing, Charles, right? Obviously, we will lean on you to help us so we can help each other. It's a partnership model, right? And the CXO platform I was talking about is a global CXO platform we want to go create. So we'd love to maybe work with you, figure out how we get a delegation out there. You'll have to educate us so we can figure out how do we leverage, all the resources more effectively and drive value.
Can I say one thing also I also find I don't want to undervalue, undersell, or underrepresent the fact that there are venture capitalists and there is investment to be made, not just in Africa, but in the Arab world and in the Middle East and in the women of Africa and the women of the Arab world and the women of the Middle East and the underrepresented populations there too. So when we're looking at investment in those regions, it's not like looking for people from the West to come invest in our region, that we really have to sort of create networks and collaborative investment platforms, I think, among us ourselves as well, right?
But it's not either or.
No, it's not either or, it's and. The answer is D, all of the above, right? And so for me, I don't know if I have my own personal chip where I feel that at this point where I am, and I am an Arab Muslim woman living in the West, where I don't want someone to tell me what my voice is, and I don't want someone to tell me how to invest in my region and develop, that I feel that it's time for the voice and maybe the information to go the other way, right? So that's sort of my own personal non-VC perspective on how that should and can work. And that was our first question. That was actually how we started leading the panel, was on those points. So I think it's super valid. Any more questions? Yes.
I'm Rabi Kouri. I'm a partner with probably the largest VC firm in the Middle East. And since we're hosting you here in the Middle East, maybe we could start about the lack of capital in the Middle East before we end up in Africa. We're probably closer in terms of GDP per capita, in terms of modernity, in terms of development. However, we have capital available in VC in the Middle East is probably 1/10 of India. The reason, for example, Kareem ended up merging with Uber was because Kareem's next round was going to be $400 million. If you combine the three top VC funds, including us, we don't come up to $300 million. So we couldn't even fund 1/10 of Kareem's round. So what's interesting about the Middle East is we have a very high GDP per capita. We're actually, at MEVP, talking about women, our first millionaire entrepreneur that we minted was a woman. We sold the company to a Japanese public company. So also in our portfolio, just in terms of presentation, 30% of our employees in our companies, and we have a portfolio of 45 companies, are women. And this was not by design, this was just by statistics. So one thing I would like to address is we need more capital in the Middle East at the later stages. So the seed, Series A, we're large Series B investors. I think that's quite funded. Beyond that, we don't have any more PE players. We don't have a go-to IPO market. That's a structural issue. The Middle East is 24 countries, 23 countries. Where do you start? People think we're just one group, 400 million people, all look the same, speak the same. It's actually very different. And, I would have liked to see on your panel somebody from the Middle East to speak about the Middle Eastern capital situation. There's also this misconception. We have very large sovereign wealth funds, but their job is not to invest in the region. Their job is to diversify out of the region. And they don't tend to be able to look at us. We're just too small. Mubadala recently, finally, created the MENA investment program. We were one of the first recipients of Mubadala's investment. So structurally, when we were speaking about Africa, I lived in the US for about 20 years, 10 years in California, Berkeley Engineering, Go Bears. We are probably closer to the VC industry in Europe and the US in terms of development, but we don't tend to get a lot of focus. We're seeing much more focus of the Chinese in our region than Europe and the US. Now, obviously, geopolitically also things are changing. Most of our oil now is sold in Asia, no more in the US. We don't guarantee the energy security. Just some comments on that.
I
Not enough, you were right.
I will say that I don't know the Middle East as well as I should, given what's going on over here. This is my third time coming to this conference. The first time I ever came to the Middle East was for this conference. So I think part of it, as Gary was talking about, it is about getting educated. We just don't know enough. But I do think the technology venture model has a few things that it requires in terms of hygiene, not necessarily, and it's probably a trajectory towards that here as well as in Africa and other countries that I actually saw firsthand starting to invest in India about 15 years ago. And we had the same issues there, and I don't even think it's fully solved there today as well, where, I moved to the US in 98, I'd never heard of venture capital. Never knew that existed. And so when I say, someone give you money to start a company? Wow, that would normally be my grandfather. I mean, that was the only one I could go to. So I think when things start changing and developing and you have successes like Kareem, and I met another company yesterday which is doing bus ride sharing and so very impressive, very impressive. And you see that, you see role models, you see that develop, people wake up and say, there is opportunity, and that 1 leads to 5, and 5 leads to 50, and 50 leads to 500. It is just a little bit of time driven, and it is democratizing all over the world, whether it's in Latin America or here, or in Africa or India. China has shown it can be done outside of the US for the first time. So I'm super excited about the trajectory of this business. I do think we will have to face these growing pains, as have every other ecosystem that have developed.
It is interesting to Rabi's point, though. I think that, when you are talking about these massive amount of funds, that it is choking out local investors from sort of from partnering in some of these deals. I think that's...
Yeah, but just to add, right, to me, I would say Mubadala has done a very good job educating, right? Exactly. I know they have set up an arm in the US, right? And that's how we learned about, what's happening in the Middle East, right? I have probably spent time at the Hub 71, met probably 15 plus companies, right? And to me, that's shaping up, and to Sumant's point, right, as a journey. And we are early in that journey, right? And a lot more work has to be done, whether it's Middle East or Africa, or for that matter, Latin America, right? And
I think we've...
Okay. My name is Chukwudiugu from Central Bank of Nigeria. Just to agree with Charles, yeah, this meant to be venture capital in Middle East and Africa. And most times when we talk about venture capital, we're always talking about the West and the top people who have succeeded. In Africa, how many young people understand venture capital? So I think that those who have succeeded, those who have some money to either do corporate social responsibility, needs to look at Middle East schools and actually start from there to educate. I think yesterday, Patrick Mosopo said by 2030, we are going to have about 400 million 15 to 24-year-old Africans. If we did not get education in the right place, that's a problem, not just for Africa, but for all of us. And today, Trump is building walls. In the global conference in Los Angeles, Milken Global Conference, while we're talking about American Dream, I said we will continue to have this problem of cross the Sahara to Europe to everywhere, unless we start thinking not just American Dream, European Dream, African Dream, Middle East Dream. We can build nations where people will want to stay at home. And we won't do it if we just talk on the top part without looking at what is happening down. How do you get the people down to the middle class? So I think education, education, education is the key. Thank
you. Yeah, no, I agree on the education, right? And I think one of the things we were talking yesterday pretty extensively, the engineering and the data science talent is something we have to invest in, right? And again, you know, as VC investors, right, it needs to be responsible investing, but also kind of working with the regions about creating a deeper talent pool and creating a training program so we can ignite the innovation to a different level.
Sumant, what have we not spoken about? What has not been said that we want to wrap up?
I mean, there's a what we haven't spoken about is what do VCs really do, and what's their job, and what's the qualification that makes someone a venture capitalist or should make someone a venture capitalist. It's probably one of the uncertified businesses that exist. You can be a VC without any certification. And sometimes I think there should be at least some basic certification, especially with some of the board members I have to deal with from other funds. So, you know, I will say that it is the venture capital. If you look at it historically, what was it? It was people who had been successful at building businesses that took their own money and then helped our next generation of people build businesses. What they understood. And I know exactly, there was a time when Kleiner Perkins was getting ready to launch their first ever fund, and the Hillman family, which is a family out of Pittsburgh that had made their money in transporting steel, said, why don't you take money from us? He said, what do you mean? We invest someone else's money, not our own? And to say, well, you'll do that? Yes, but why would we take it from you? So we'll give you a profit interest. We'll give you a 20% of the profits you made. And that became institutionalized. And all of us now exist on that model 40 years later. And, you know, it's not a very old industry. It's a cottage industry to some, you know, degree. It's kind of, people stay where they are, they invest in things they know, they help the people they know, and it kind of grows from there. So I think at some point
it's a cottage industry that's shaping the very face of our reality as we know it,
now
right?
It is.
Like, yeah.
Now it is. But I mean, I'm just giving historically. So in some ways, it has evolved naturally. It has evolved naturally as technology has grown and become all pervasive. And it will also evolve naturally as other geographies develop and more innovation comes out of it. Yeah. So I agree with everything we've talked about. I do think we should demystify the VC's role. It's not that, you know, heroic at all. The heroics are the people who start companies, who have a vision, and then find people like us to help them.
Carter, final words?
I thought I gave my final words, but yeah, no, I think it's good to keep in perspective. 14 billion is a lot, but it's not a lot when you think about private equity and other asset classes. I think the point, you know, some of the description was as venture capitalists, we all have kind of a moral duty to make sure we're kind of putting money to work in a positive way that affects the world in a positive manner. And then I think the thing I think about all the time is just, I think we're going to continue to see change, and we're going to continue to see rapid change, right? So how companies get funded, the type of companies that are built. And I think we brought out a lot of things that kind of were in the early days, and hopefully we can continue to kind of, do more and do better. So.
I would say, right, responsible investing and just not putting the money. How do you accelerate the value while mitigating the risk, right? And create an impact in the society.
All right, gentlemen, that's our panel.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.